Welcome to our last panel for today. And look, we've got a very distinguished panel, and I want to leave as much room as possible for you to speak to the panel. So I am planning to introduce each of our panellists as I ask them a single question, and then I'm going to throw it to the floor. My name is Michaela Browning. I'm an Australian first and from Google second. So that'll do as an introduction from me. Can I start our last panel for the day with Ambassador Sujan Chinoy? So Ambassador Sujan Chinoy is Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis in New Delhi, an extremely distinguished institute for those of you who are not familiar. He is also the chair of Think 20 Engagement Group for India's G20 presidency, with an enormously important role this year for thinking about the strategic questions that we should be considering in the G20 and beyond. He is a distinguished career diplomat. He was India's ambassador to Japan, Mexico, High Commissioner to Belize, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Consul General in Shanghai and in Sydney, a specialist on China and East Asia, and headed the India-China expert group on diplomatic and military officials, dealing with the boundary dispute and confidence-building measures. No easy task. Ambassador Chinoy, can I start with you? As the chair of the T20, we're reminded that the theme for the G20 this year, as Foreign Minister Jaishankar mentioned, is One Earth, One Family, One Future. India has an ambitious goal to narrow the economic divide between the global north and south. What role can India play as a bridge and manage competing expectations in this regard? No easy task. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I thank ASPI and ORF for inviting me. It's really great to be back in Sydney, where I lived for 3 years. But that was a long time ago, 17 years ago. And at that point, we were pushing the relationship to see if it could go beyond cricket, curry, and the Commonwealth. And I'm very glad to see that today it's a very different relationship. I also learnt to sledge by playing for a Masters team on the North Shore. So don't take me lightly. I'm very happy to be seated next to Peter because in Peter we have another colleague who has worked very hard to push this relationship. But coming back to the G20, let's put it this way. The G20 essentially is a group which is the most representative of international groupings today at a time when multilateralism is greatly weakened, if not completely eroded. And there is a similar kind of assessment of the MDBs as well. In that kind of gridlocked situation on the international highway, the G20 will provide a wayside station, a pull-aside stop where people can get down, stretch their legs, have a coffee, and actually try and go in for low-hanging fruit. So with 85% of the GDP represented by the G20, 75% of the global trade, and 2/3 of global population, I think it's time for us to use the G20. The other point is that India's presidency of the G20 coincides with a troika that is from the developing world, and we therefore intend to cast our net as wide as possible to make it as inclusive as possible, and that is actually that sentiment expressed in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or One Earth, One Family, One Future. And I think this is a particularly opportune moment for the BRICS, the Quad, and others to reconcile their views, shared views, differences, etc. For all these are represented in the G20. Japan happens to be the G7 president. Therefore, this is again a wonderful moment. Australia is hosting the Quad. And for the fence-sitters or those in doubt in ASEAN, for instance, you have a country like Indonesia leading the charge of the Light Brigade there. So I think this is a very opportune moment for India to take the G20 discourse a notch up. And one of the ways to do it is to not necessarily work as the G20, 19 economies plus the EU all together, we might not be able to agree on everything, but to break it up into doable teams, bilateral, trilateral, minilaterals. And I think there's great scope here for India and Australia to work together, not just in our space, that is the Indian Ocean, but your space as well, in the Pacific, where we have Micronesia, where you have the United States and Japan as potential do-gooders, in Melanesia, where you will have Australia and New Zealand, and in Polynesia, where you can have the Quad Plus type of partners working with us, such as France, for instance.
Well, thank you. Well, we might come back to this theme that you've brought up, which is about North-South. It's also about the ambition of inclusion in a much more contested world. I think Larry Summers said we are living in a period of unprecedented, complex interconnectedness, or interconnected complexity, I think he said, since the last 75 years. And so I think that presents a challenge when you're thinking about the sorts of ambitions you have for inclusion and promoting collaboration, when we're also dealing fundamentally with a lot of contestability. So we might ask our other panellists about that later. Can I now come to Secretary Jan Adams? Secretary Jan Adams was appointed the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in July last year. She's one of Australia's most distinguished diplomats. She has been Australia's ambassador to Japan, to China. She has been the Deputy Secretary and head of all trade and economic issues. She had an extraordinarily important role in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which then became the CPTPP. Unfortunately, we would like the Americans to join. We can come back to that another time. But she also spearheaded and was able to conclude Australia's free trade agreements with Japan, China and Korea, an extraordinary achievement. She's advised ministers of trade, industry, science and technology. She's served at the OECD Secretariat in Paris and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Jan, can I ask you, India is going to be a $1 trillion digital economy by 2025, according to some measures. In our own region, Southeast Asia alone is expected to have $1 trillion in digital trade by 2030. We are still dealing with pandemic recovery, indebtedness, and we want also to find an inclusive, open, secure and sustainable ability to trade and grow together. But to do this and to realise the potential, we need trusted data flows and interoperability. This is a very big challenge. We have 1,300 new regulations since January 2020 in relation to data alone. What can Australia and India do to promote trust and confidence, to shape standards, to build capability to promote inclusive, sustainable trade and find solutions to some of the world's most complex problems?
Well, thanks, Michaela. That's a lot of questions, but let me thank the organisers and the audience for putting together this program today. It's very impressive. Look, I think perhaps there's two components of the answer. One is rules and frameworks and another is skills and people. So if I think of rules and frameworks, I think 1,300 new regulations on data, it's the first time I've heard that, that's quite terrifying. Obviously, if you're a business person trying to do global or regional operations, it's pretty hard if you don't have a consistent framework to work with. So clearly there would be a role for bilateral, but preferably regional or multilateral rules and agreements that dealt with things like privacy, the cross-border privacy provisions that we can include in FTAs, for example, in free trade agreements. You'd like to see really rules that, or frameworks that allowed people to consider the data flows to be trusted. As you say, And actually, I think Dr. Jaishankar also mentioned this morning, you really want your data, not just your personal data, but your whole data systems, secure, trusted, and somehow or other you need that. You need external confidence given to that. So clearly, there's an enormous amount of work to do there. I think IPEF is also one of the groupings that's trying to come to grips with this, as well as G20's work India's work in G20. So look, we'll support that at a rules-based level wherever we can. I can see how important it is, particularly for startup, smaller companies. You've got to rely on a system somewhere. Competency and people, I think, skills, people, digital skills, I think actually we should ask you from Google to talk about it probably. I think the companies have probably got a huge capacity to do skills uplift in the region. From a government point of view, I can see the education, the people-to-people links, the education links, the recognition of qualifications, those kinds of practical things also making a contribution. But there must be also a huge contribution from the corporate side that's feasible, probably happening, and I don't know enough about it.
Well, thank you. I'll take up the opportunity to reflect on that just for a minute, because I think that there are three component parts if we think about building trust and confidence, particularly around data and trusted data flows. First is the rules and the standards that you've alluded to in FTAs and institutional agreements and bilateral undertakings, and initiatives like the CBPR, which, for example, corporations like Google have signed up to, and we also fund small businesses being able to certify themselves, because actually they're the ones that are the most impacted, having to try and navigate the costs and complexity of legal compliance with the numbers of rules and regulations that are proliferating. So there's that component to it, and I think that Australia and India can set some important standards. Then there's a second bit, which is about the products and services that companies need to offer in order to provide the trust and confidence. And then the third is capacity building, and that's both digital literacy and also the skills that you need to navigate. And this is an absolutely massive and ongoing challenge, because the technology is evolving, and indeed Google does make a big contribution, as do others. We've trained 70 million people across the region, 30 million women across 300 villages in India, for example, through Internet Sati program, and 1 million women, small and medium-sized enterprise owners through Women Will, as just two prime examples in India, which is enormously important. But that challenge becomes increasingly complex when we think about AI and other things, and so there's no end to the need to invest in skilling, I think. Can I come to our third speaker, Dr. Radhika Kapoor. Dr. Kapoor is a Senior Visiting Fellow at the India Council for Research on International Economic Relations and an accomplished economist, an expert in labour economics, which is enormously significant at the moment. She's worked at the Planning Commission for the Government of India and at the International Labour Organisation. She is an expert on India's labour market and in areas of the informal economy, the impact of technological changes on the world of work, the measurement of employment and unemployment, the role of labour regulations in industrial performance. And in 2019, she co-edited a book, Towards a Just, Dignified and Secure Future of Work, Lessons from India. I can't think of a more important topic if we think about the future, and particularly for a place like India, but actually for all of us, and so much to learn from India's example. Dr. Kapoor, can I ask you about what are some of the things that we need to think about in terms of just that goal of creating a just, dignified and secure future of work? What are the lessons from India that you can summarise for those of us who are really keenly interested in that example? What more do we need to do, and what can Australia and India do together, including through the G20 in a really critical year, to put the spotlight on inclusion and outcomes in this regard?
Right. Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. Your question is very pertinent, and in the context of this conversation, I don't want to simply answer it from the lens of India. I want to take it up from a global South perspective, and I'll tell you why. Because the first time I actually started working on issues related to the G20 was on the subject of the future of work. And at that time, the presidency of the G20 was with Argentina, and we were asked by the Department of Economic Affairs, which is housed in the Ministry of Finance, to prepare a paper on the future of work. And we were given certain documents which were prepared by the OECD and the IMF and the World Bank on the subject. And as I navigated through those documents, it occurred to me how disconnected the lexicon of the G20 was on the subject from the realities, the ground realities of the labor markets, the firm landscape in South Asia and global South more broadly. Therefore, before I answer your question, I want to say that one particular initiative that I'm particularly excited about in the context of the G20 this year is the initiative of the Voice of South that the Indian presidency has taken up. Because given that we are faced with a confluence of calamities, the health crisis, the climate crisis, the cost of living crisis, which manifests through the fuel and the food crisis, all of these have had a disproportionate impact on the global South. And looking ahead, the path ahead for these countries is even more challenging because we have monetary tightening happening in the US. And that has adverse implications for all these economies in the context of exchange rate depreciation, a deterioration in their balance of payments, destroying their industrial sector because you're seeing a rise of protectionist policies, national industrial policies, which hurts industrialization and job growth in the global South. So let's take a more global South perspective over here. And there are a couple of issues I'd like to highlight. One is the fact that, for much of the global South, which is still trying to go up the trajectory and up the income ladder, the avenues of growth and employment generation through the traditional path of manufacturing-led growth have become limited. This is driven by two factors. One, technological change, because earlier there were options of export-oriented growth, but now there is reshoring, there is friendshoring. Technology no longer makes it so lucrative to outsource to developing economies. So technology has created that obstacle for developing countries in their path of structural transformation. And secondly, like I mentioned, there is the rising trends of protectionism. And that makes it harder for us to integrate into global supply chains, into global value chains, which is, again, a very important pathway for growth and development. So the first thing that we could cooperate on is how do we make our value chains more inclusive? We've talked about how we make them more resilient and sustainable, but how do we make them more inclusive so that developing countries still have that option of moving up the income ladder through export-oriented growth? The second issue, which is again very relevant to the global South and India in particular, is the role of women in the workforce. Now, our female labor force participation rate is abysmally low. It's somewhere around 30%. Now, you cannot have inclusive growth and development unless more women are brought into the workforce. And even in the rest of the global South, those numbers are very low. And that, again, has much to do with the kind of structural transformation that we have undergone. Of course, there are social and cultural factors which are specific to every country, which can't be dealt through global cooperation. But then there are, it's important to think about ways where we can collaborate for creating more employment opportunities for women, for growth of women-led SMEs, conversations on the care economy, which definitely need to be had at the G20 level, and of course, education and skilling of women. And the third issue I want to talk about, and that's not just the global South, it's also in the global North, is this rise of gig workers. Now, the rise of the gig worker is happening largely because the technological changes that we're seeing in the world of work are leading to a proliferation of non-standard employer-employee arrangements. And what that means is that you basically have a lot of people who are self-employed, or they're called independent contractors. But essentially, this is very precarious work. There's no job stability. Your earnings, may be are often lower than what they are of people in regular jobs. You don't have access to social security. There is no trajectory, set trajectory in your career. So it's basically a very precarious position. And a lot of young workers, people who are doing their first jobs, not just in the global south, but also in the global north, are entering the workforce on these very precarious terms of work. So I think one very important conversation that we need to have is that how do we make the workplace more secure? More specifically, how do we design social security mechanisms that can provide social security to those who are outside the ambit of standard employer-employee relationships, and how that's going to be funded? Because you don't have a standard employer who can contribute to that. You have multiple employers. And for a lot of developing countries, this is particularly challenging because we don't have the fiscal space for the state to actually intervene and provide that social security. So those would be, the 3 bullet points that I'd like to make in the context of the Global South.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd certainly like to come back to digital enablement in changing that, because certainly from Google's experience and the data that we see on small business creation, small businesses' ability to export, they're 90% more likely if they're digitally enabled, and people who are exporting get paid more and earn more. So it should be an encouragement to trade, and certainly, so having the products and services and the ability to navigate those rules and regulations and trade can be transformative for people. So technology can be a contributor to resolving, and also a challenge in terms of skills and access. Can I come to our final panellist, Peter Varghese? And Peter Varghese has been the Chancellor of the University of Queensland since July 2016. I hope that's correct, Peter. And was formerly the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, High Commissioner to India, High Commissioner to Malaysia, Director General of the Office of National Assessments, Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister, and is an enormously distinguished Australian diplomat. He's also received an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Queensland in 2013. I need to tell the audience that I have 2 of my former bosses, Peter and Jan, on this panel here today, so I'll probably be getting spoken to afterwards if I don't do a good enough job. Peter, can I ask you, you've spoken very prominently on the era in which we find ourselves, more contestable, more complex era. How can India and Australia, including through the G20, which is a topic for our panel, but also in the Quad and in other fora, address some of the most pressing challenges that we confront together and make a contribution to how the globe can address some of these challenges? And what reflections do you have about this crucial bilateral relationship and what our priorities should be in that regard?
Well, thanks very much, Michaela, and may I also thank ASPI and ORF for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I think if you're looking at the partnership between Australia and India, and I'd emphasise the word partnership, there are a couple of areas where I think the opportunities are huge and the environment is actually quite conducive. If you start with our geopolitical environment, which, as everyone says, is going through a profound transition, we can work together in 2 very significant ways. The first is the big project of arriving at a new balance in the Indo-Pacific, a new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific. And how do you construct that in a way that both engages China, but also constrains China? Because I think Australia and India would both like to see a framework which captures those 2 elements, as opposed to a full-blown hard containment of China, which is, I think, where we might otherwise drift towards in the absence of being able to shape it more to our interests. So we have a certain congruence in that project. It's not an identity of interests because we're 2 countries that live in different strategic circumstances and have different strategic relationships, but there is a very significant congruence of interest in doing that. The second, and this is something which I think people have spoken about this afternoon, is we're not just making a transition in terms of where our equilibrium is, we're making a transition in terms of a movement towards multipolarity. Now, Australia has never navigated a multipolar world. There is nothing in our strategic culture which equips us to navigate a multipolar world intellectually. India, on the other hand, has lived and breathed multipolarity, a long history of it if you go back centuries, but more so in terms of how it's always seen its own geopolitical posture, which is as one of the poles in a multipolar world. So I think the capacity to work through what polarity is going to mean is something that ought to bring India and Australia together. The second area I'd emphasise, and I would not have done this 5 years ago, is a multilateral partnership. Now, Australia and India have a rather fraught multilateral history because on big issues like trade liberalisation and nuclear non-proliferation, historically we've been on the opposite side of the argument. But now I think there is a real opportunity for us to be both engaged in reinventing multilateralism, because boy, do we need to reinvent multilateralism. I mean, universal multilateralism is on life support. Regional multilateralism is performing exceptionally tepidly. We need to find a way to achieve genuine multilateral objectives because of all of the global and other challenges we face that can work. And I think the times are going to suit India as a multilateral broker. And I say that because, one, India can work north-south and east-west. There are very few countries around who can work both of those axes. Secondly, India's own sort of political economy culture has put it sort of somewhere in between a market view of the world and a state interventionist view of the world. And the world is moving more into that space. I mean, away from where Australia has been, because Australia is sort of much more in the classic Washington consensus, trade liberalisation, open market economy. So India's got the capacity, I think, to navigate that. And if our big challenge into the future from a multilateral economic point of view is to hang on to as much of the furniture as we can of an open economic system, and I personally believe that is our big challenge, then I think India's experience is going to be particularly appropriate. So I think there is a big opportunity there for Australia and India to work together on multilateralism. And the G20, I mean, I think India's chairing of the G20 will bring some of these themes together. And the G20, out of all of the sort of multilateral options available to us, is maybe easier to revive than some of the other instruments. Partly because of the nature of the G20. It's one of the few multilateral institutions that can match means and ends, because that's always a big problem, I think, in multilateralism. So I'd emphasise those two. And then obviously, in terms of where we go on our economic relationship, there's a lot of work to be done. It's got a lot of growth tissue, but I think it's still an underdeveloped relationship. I think corporate Australia still doesn't quite get the India story. And the biggest missing or largely missing element is investment. Because I think investment will be the key to a really deeper economic relationship. And we heard Dr. Jaishankar talk about manufacturing, and you can see it in Indian economic policy. So Australia needs to think about how trade and investment come together and what the synergies of the two are. And part of that will be a manufacturing story, although exactly how, I think, is still to be worked out.
There's a lot in there. And can I ask Jan just to come in as the current Secretary of the Foreign Service? You've been the climate change Ambassador, you've actually tackled complex negotiations with the likes of China and Japan and others, including beyond India, and you're currently thinking about the Australia-India relationship to reflect on that multilateralism and on the economic relationship with India. Any further reflections?
Oh, well, thank you. I think if I start maybe with G20, I think the way that India is assuming the presidency with a well thought out strategy for linking north-south and of course east-west is really important. Dr. Jaishankar said this morning they consulted India, the government of India consulted 123 countries at head of government or ministerial level. I don't recall anything like it. 123 phone calls to say what's your top three, or I'm not sure exactly what he asked, but doing a poll and using that to define an agenda that is relevant to the global south as well as relevant to G20, and that actually, if G20 was working, could do something about. So, these are the top sort of economic issues of food security, energy security, fertilisers. The disruption from Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had profound effects on all of those three areas. I think from our perspective, just as a footnote, we would add of concern to, as well as those actual substantive issues, the fact that the discussion of these issues has been weaponised even where a lot of commentary would have it that it's the Western sanctions that have caused these problems, whereas I think it's just patently untrue. Anyway, so a really impressive attempt to build on the success of Indonesia in actually getting the G20 back in business after a bad few years, frankly, in Bali. So, full admiration, credit, and of course national level support to India for that project. I think as Peter has said, it's more important than, well, you can't say more important than ever. People always say that. But it really is a time where we do need to be putting in investment to getting things working better in terms of global economic issues, but also, of course, trying to deal with some of the big geopolitical shifts and changes and disruptions, if I talk about the war. So, sorry, it's a long, not so precise answer, but I just really can see that India's leadership of G20 this year is going to give us a lot of good mechanisms for starting to tackle some of the big multilateral, but also north-south, we used to say, global south, global north, global south issues. Because if we don't do that, then the sense of disempowerment and non-inclusivity and inequality compounds and, of course, leads to worsening of the complexities that we're already dealing with.
Thank you. Can I ask the audience if there are any questions?
May I? Natasha Chaubaskar from the Newland Global Group. My question is to Peter. Thank you for those insightful remarks on the economic relationship between Australia and India. Now, as author of the India Economic Strategy to 2035, post-COVID, how do you see things really changing from an economic perspective? What surprises? We've seen foreign companies getting into the India market, understanding the India growth story, getting excited about the market, building that confidence. What really you think we need to change in corporate Australia to get them believe or to some extent develop that confidence for the Indian market? It's been a harrowing task. We repeatedly talk about trade, investment. sessions after sessions, the discussions, it's almost become very predictable to imagine what will be said in a particular session. But nothing is changing, so what sort of new frameworks, new tools are required to get the Australian corporates interested and believe in the India growth story?
Well, I'm not sure there's any magical new framework or tools available to us. I mean, this is a question of persistence and consistency, because essentially we're looking at a consciousness-raising exercise, and we're looking at how do we get the Australian corporate sector to give more attention to India than they otherwise would. Now, Australian corporates, not surprisingly, tend to go to places that they know, that they think might be easy, and that they recognize have opportunities. And you need to fit the Indian narrative into that reality. It's not the case of saying to them, you all must have an India strategy. But it is a case of saying to the larger companies, you should at the very least be asking yourself the question, should India be a part of our medium to long-term strategy? Now, some of the changes in global geopolitics and the economic currents will probably help in that regard. I mean, the China story is looking very different. And at a headline level, people kind of get the scale of India. So as China has been rethought, there's probably a natural instinct to think about whether India is an alternative. I think the whole supply line reimagining and recalibrating can work hugely to India's favour if India is able to make further progress on ease of doing business, infrastructure, all of the things that the Indian government is very conscious of and which Indian economic policy is focused on. So I think it's a combination of those sort of macro currents together with just trying to get this message out in as effective a way as possible. But it doesn't happen quickly.
Can I add to that?
Yes, of course, and then we're going to 2 minutes, Mike Green.
Okay, so just to add to that, I think that there's still this perception that India is very difficult to do business in. And, since 2014, we've had a very clear strategy in terms of the fact that we want to accelerate the growth of our manufacturing sector. Because before this, there was some sort of belief, like Dr. Jaishankar also mentioned, that we've achieved high growth rates through service-led growth, and we can leapfrog that phase of manufacturing-led growth. But there's been a reversal in that stance, and there is a recognition of the importance of the manufacturing sector in the growth of the Indian economy. And that's not just happened at the central level of the government, but also at the state level. So what I would say is that you should get those investors not just in New Delhi, but take them to state capitals, where the state chief ministers are rolling out red carpets to attract foreign investors. And I should, apart from the advances that we made in terms of the ease of doing business, infrastructure, the national logistics policy, single window clearances, there is also the production-linked incentive scheme, which is giving huge incentives and subsidies for doing business in India. So if I could make a plug for India there.
It's a good reminder of the vastness of the opportunity and the need to engage, particularly at the state level. I know it was Mike Green next, and I think we're actually on time. So I'll be in trouble with, that's okay. So yes, we've got 2 more questions. So
Mike Green from the previous panel. I really appreciate Dr. Kapoor's comments on women's economic empowerment. That will be probably the top theme at the San Francisco APEC Summit the U.S. is hosting. It would be a wonderful thing if it migrated to also be a major theme in India's G20, the East Asia Summit, after COVID in particular, given what you know about the statistics. I'm always smart when I listen to Peter Varghese, and it's in that spirit that I ask Peter, and Jan or others may want to comment. I'm a little stuck on the opportunities in multilateralism. Speaking from the American experience, India votes against the US and probably Australia in the UN General Assembly far more than with. We're not poster children for trade liberalization in the US, but trade liberalization with India is harder, not easier. And the G20 is going to be awfully contentious because of Russia. Are you talking about a different agenda in these multilateral forums? I'm trying to understand that. The US approach to all these things has been to just ignore them because the economics and the geopolitics and increasingly in the US-India relationship, the diaspora and the cultural connection is just so powerful. But if you could clarify that, Peter, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so I mean, my focus was on how do you save the concept of multilateralism at a time when the structures of multilateralism are failing or have failed. So you could take virtually every multilateral organization that currently exists, and at best they're struggling, at worst they're defunct. Now, unless you think that multilateralism as such is unnecessary or a low priority, we need to find a way out of this. And that could well involve creating either new structures or a completely different way of operating within existing structures. So when I say there's an opportunity for partnership with India, I don't necessarily mean that we are going to go into those multilateral institutions with the same position. In fact, in many ways, I'd be surprised if we did. We certainly haven't in the past. We might get a bit closer into the future. But India has a capacity to help either reimagine or re-engineer or recalibrate some of those multilateral institutions that we should be taking advantage of and working with India to do that. I don't know if that makes
Can I
it
ask
clearer.
Ambassador Sujan Shinoy to add?
Thank you. So, no, taking off from what Peter just said, one of the greatest advantages that the United States has in a partner like India is that we do not necessarily vote with you. That is what precisely gives us great credibility as your partner, right? So, I actually, as the Ideas Bank, I do often give an idea. But so you must appreciate the fact that in India, that actually does not necessarily vote in tandem with the US, works to your advantage. This is because the world has been offered too many binary choices. And in a situation of the type that we see in the Indo-Pacific, we are today experiencing distress on 6 factors. I describe these as the 6 T's. The first is trade. The second is technology. The third is territorial differences. The fourth is terrorism. The fifth is tenets, as in narratives, contending narratives. And the sixth is trust or the lack of it. So in a complex environment like this, it is a country like India that can actually work with others like Australia and other like-minded partners to provide choices. Now, when you go in tandem with a big power to a small island country, you have greater credibility. If a middle power like India or a rising power like India also works with the United States or with France or with the UK, the smaller nations do not experience the pressures of a binary choice. So just as well that we are actually not necessarily voting with the US on everything. The other point I want to make is that almost every known vector of globalization is under stress today. So it's not just trade and technology, but also capital and movement of people. And at a time like this, we have to see what is possible and what is not possible. Now, trade is very difficult to control. So you've seen that even as efforts were being made to decouple, you see a rise in US-China trade. You see a phenomenal rise post-Galwan, post our bloody conflict with the Chinese in Ladakh, that our trade has shot up to $135 billion. That's because trade is very fungible, and it's also spearheaded not by the salons of the ministries of foreign affairs, but by the people in industry. It is in the space of technology and investment that much more can be done to restrict collaboration, and that's precisely where it hurts the most. So that is being done. I think the value that India can bring is on 3 issues. One, that we can seek to promote the voice of the global south with regard to financing. Financing is a key issue. Blended finance, hybrid finance, and also finance coming out of the MBDs. In the MBDs in particular, the special drawing rights is an issue that needs to be completely reviewed from the archaic quota system. The second point is about lifestyle for environment. That's the Prime Minister's, main proposal. Because when we look at net zero, it addresses only emissions. It does not address the action that each individual must take to become a pro-planet people. And so lifestyle for environment, the idea that Prime Minister of India has given, Mr. Modi has given, is something worth considering. The third is food security. India is a country that exports a lot of wheat. Recently, we have given wheat to not just Afghanistan, but also 61,000 tons to Egypt. So we can play a role there. But 2023 is the year of millets. And India is the world's largest producer of millets. 41% of all global millets are produced in India. So it's time to look sharply at food security. So these are some of the broad points where India can actually push some new ideas during the G20. Unless you do something about employment, about climate change, and about these binary choices on strategic issues, we will not get far. We have the credibility because we do have good relations with almost all the people in the room. And let me say, even with China, we seek stable relations. It's just that we do not agree to, subscribe to the kind of unilateralism or militarism that they show, and we certainly do not agree to their proposition that bloodshed should be normalized in our bilateral ties. We're willing to look at our differences and resolve them through peaceful negotiations, but if there is bloodshed, then it's obvious that our ties are not normal.
Hugely significant issues, and I think if I can reflect on the panel, because I think we've gone over time. So I know we had another question, but if I can just reflect that, if nothing else, this panel absolutely underscored how important inclusion and sustainability are as strategically significant drivers, and that without a commitment to those, we're not going to be able to navigate an increasingly complex set of questions and challenges for ourselves. We do want to have another question. Apparently, we're allowed to have another question. I'm trying to take mixed signals.
Oh, well,
thank you.
Thank you for that. Unexpected. Both Peter Varghese and Dr. Kapoor touched on the ease of business question, and I agree with Dr. Kapoor that it's in some ways a surprising question. I find Indian companies quite a pleasure to deal with. Also, it occurs to me that there's a focus on Australian companies going to India saying it's all too hard, not just from the ease of business, but where do I start? It's a massive economy. It's a massive country, very diverse, all these religions and languages and all these differences. It occurs to me that Australia is a population of 25 million people, 1.4 billion in India. With 29 states, perhaps companies here should focus on maybe one state, each of which has a population well in excess of Australia. Do you have any view on that?
Well, so if you look at the way the manufacturing sector is spread across the country, it's essentially concentrated in a few states. And what the trends tell us is that most of the new investment that is coming is also going to these states only, be it Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, because they're agglomeration economies from industrialization. So one way of looking at it is go to those states where you already have those agglomeration economies to exploit. The other alternative is to go to states which are desperately trying to create an industrial sector and are willing to give out more subsidies, more incentives, and roll out the red carpet. That's a tricky question, but as I understand that there is an entire industry, and I met a couple of people here who actually guide corporates where to go and invest. But it's, in our federal system of governance, there is a lot of competition across states. And so pitting one against the other could help you get the best deal for your business.
Any other reflections from the panel?
Well, I mean, scale is alluring at one level, but it's also daunting at another level. And the reason in the India economic strategy that I worked on that we focused on sectors and states was to try and make that more digestible. So saying here are 10 states that you should really focus on, or 10 sectors that you should focus on. And I think, you know, that's sort of a practical starting point. But you need something like that, I think, to translate the sort of, you know, big picture pitch on India to something a bit more practical.
Well, thank you all. Can I thank ASPI and the Observer Research Foundation for hosting us here today, and our very distinguished panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.